Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Scruton Dobson, and him, Tim Batten. Today we discuss, what does Karl Marx and Roger Scruton want us to do in our free time? Tim.
One of the things I notice, and of course some people will accuse me of either the genealogical fallacy or kind of pseudo horseshoe theorism, is that the fringes oftentimes come to the same insights. And the fringes often live very similar lives. So one of the similar insights, for example, that the fringes come to is like most fringes oppose lots of these wars: the Iraq War, War on Terror, COVID. If you go far enough left, people oppose the COVID mandates. Oftentimes, not all, but some, more than the center. And there's like one of the things about like consumer capitalist society, which is my main point today, is that the fringes, to a large extent, all oppose it. So people like Jeff Deist, people like Roger Scruton, Peter Hitchens, I could even throw in some others there too if I want, Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul, are to some extent critical of the way many people consume, like, so to speak, degenerate consumerism. You know, speaking of Taylor Swift, you know, Disney, NFL, name those type things. But another group of people who's critical of the kind of Disney, NFL, mainstream television and so forth is the Frankfurt School. It's Deleuze, it's Guattari, it's Horkheimer, it's Adorno, it's Alain Badiou. These guys, and yes, they're all guys, aren't exactly pro-capitalist consumerism. I mean, they're one of their points is this is all just recycled garbage. It's just the same thing every 20 years recycled. And people like Deleuze and Guattari will make this point about being hyper real and things like that. And I always thought, after reading these guys and then reading someone like Pat Buchanan or even James Burnham at times, is that they're saying similar things. They're saying it from different parts of the spectrum, so to speak, but they're saying similar things about the sort of mainstream economy here. And one of the things which Jeff Deist once quipped on a podcast, or actually was a Mises Institute lecture, but I cannot find it, and I hope he said this, but I'm almost certain he said this, was he was annoyed he had to drive his kids to all these different activities. Now, I was kind of annoyed at Deist when he said it, because I rolled my eyes, because I'm like, Jeff, like, what else are your kids supposed to do? I mean, Deist, to be fair, I would put him in the paleo conservative camp at this point of the current existing society. He probably thinks that, however, the left critics of Deist probably would say Deist is a de facto defender of the car-centric suburban lifestyle of be busy type mentality, which his kids are involved in. You know, what else are the kids are going to do if they aren't being driven around to all these activities in the car-centric suburban household? I mean, be at home all day? What are people supposed to do? Now, on the popular level, the left tends to be very pro-consumer capitalist culture. There's a book that Scruton recommended, which I think Keith Preston recommended at first, was Manufactured from Above. I mean, it's probably correct that some popular culture is, you know, a CIA psyop or a Rockefeller psyop or something like that operation that's somewhat manufactured from above. That's potential. And by popular consumer capitalist culture, I mean Disney, I mean Apple, 20 different brands of trucks and jeans and so forth. That's the kind of popular consumer culture. And the religious right oftentimes criticizes the Taylor Swifts, the 20 different jeans, the 20 different trucks that do basically the same things and so forth. Now, does this make those paleo conservatives crypto-Marxists? I don't know. You could also say that the Marxists could be crypto-paleo conservatives by criticizing this capitalist culture, this consumer capitalist culture. I think this puts people like Jeff Deist and Ron Paul, and it's also Pat Buchanan, Roger Scruton, and so forth, into an awkward position. If I want to name who's the most consistent cultural theorist today, as annoying as it sounds, it's probably Nick Gillespie and Reason Magazine. Nick Gillespie is very supportive of actual existing consumer capitalist society as it actually exists. He thinks porn's fine. He thinks movies are fine. He thinks Taylor Swift's fine. He has no trouble with the NFL or sports betting. He does have a trouble with publicly funded stadiums. He's not a big fan of the wars, but he doesn't get into the conspiracy aspect of the wars. He just takes them at straightforward value. So I would say Nick Gillespie is like the current consumer society's defender at its best. When people engage in debates at the Soho Forum over like who's going to make the Kenny Lofton records, this was Gene Epstein's point versus Ben Burgess. I think a lot of the paleo conservatives wouldn't really like the point that Gene Epstein would be making there if it was fleshed out, because it would implicitly mean, in my opinion, I think this is correct, it would lead to the Harry Potter fetishism, the Star Wars fetishism, and various other fan fiction fetishism that get to, which goes further radical. But Nick Gillespie is okay with all that. Now, I think to flip around and say Nick Gillespie is some kind of Stalinist is also stupid. If the right does that to Nick Gillespie, I think that's also stupid. But I would say someone like Nick Gillespie is the perfect paradigm example of like this defending consumer society as it actually exists. Consumer capitalist society as it actually exists. Yes, there's lots of cronyism, blah, 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 and so forth. Now, I'm getting more questions. So, Swithin, you are at times critical of your wife/family spending, air quotes, your money. I mean, in this way, you remind me somewhat of Jeff Deist's comments he made there. My question is, what are people supposed to do with their quote-unquote free time? Now, as we discussed in a recent episode on the case against natalism, one of the things that fathers, and this is even true today in our more feminized culture, fathers still work. Married fathers who stay married with children work way more than single guys. There's some asterisks you could throw in there, but that's like part of what you're signing up to. Now, children are interesting in the sense that children, in theory, have more free time than adults, and that's part of what childhood is to some extent. I mean, school takes away this and so forth, and we don't work. It's legal for children to work, so of course they have to do all these activities, and these activities cost money and stuff. But like, I'm not just talking about children. What are adults supposed to do with their free time? Let's just say we have to work, but you got paid the same amount. What would you do with that other half of time? You can't work during that time. Because one of the problems that irritates me about the paleo right, which I think the paleo economic left, the radical leftists actually get, is that work equals that worked hours at some point mean consumption. So let's say you're an Amish carpenter. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with an Amish carpenter, remodeling a healthcare or a consumer capitalist advertising executive's house with a new kitchen every 10 years. The problem for the Amish carpenter, he's not making a porno. The problem for the Amish carpenter is the reason that he's getting paid is because the corporate executive whose house he's remodeling has a lot of extra money to spend. Now, why does he have extra money to spend? Well, people are buying their products that executive selling. And this is capitalism at its best. Not in the crony form. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about faking pandemics and manufacturing pandemics and manufacturing wars in the Ukraine. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about consumer capitalism in its quote-unquote ideal form. People want to buy new coats. People want to buy new kitchens. But let's go back to the carpenter example. Remodeling this kitchen, he's probably paid a lot of money to do so. I would say that Amish carpenter is very much dependent on the sort of consumerist machine out there. Whether he likes it or not. I mean, if everyone lived like the Amish carpenter lived, he wouldn't have a job, or he wouldn't have his job at the same level. He wouldn't have as much demand. But if everyone lived frugal lifestyles, and maybe this makes me sort of closeted Keynesian, if everyone lived a frugal lifestyle, people wouldn't have any money to spend on these things. So, like, if everyone fixed their own car, no one would be employed in a mechanic industry. If people didn't go and take long vacations, there wouldn't be an airline industry. There wouldn't be a car industry to service them. So, again, I would say Nick Gillespie is the establishment at its best. You might not like Nick Gillespie, but I just think that's the establishment best. So my answer to the free time is virtuous hobbies. Now, I'm thinking of the objections that Adorno or Horkheimer or Guattari, or as well as Roger Scruton would make to me. And they would say, well, your hobbies are just a form of pseudo mindless consumerism. Let's say, bike racing. Well, you're just spending lots of money on different brands. You're just pursuing meaningless trophies and so forth. Or let's say you're engaged in community soccer at an amateur level. Well, again, they say, well, you're just LARPing professionals. I'm trying to describe these hobbies in a way that they might describe it to me. or they will. I mean, I do notice, or let's say you enjoy history, so you go out and travel. I can hear the paleo leftist and the paleo conservative critic saying the same thing. You're just going to Disney World. You know, Paris has been Disneyized. I've actually already made the point that Paris has been Disneyized. Anyway, Egypt's been Disneyized and so forth. So that would be their critique against a lot of quote unquote things people do in their free times. They go on vacations, they go play sports, or worse yet, they watch sports. So with that, I've rambled for 10 minutes. I don't want to hog the microphone here. What do you think people should do in their free time? If it's more work, then at some point that consumption has to be cashed out. If it's not work, it will be hobbies. It seems like the only thing that intellectuals want us to doing is reading books, debating books, or making a revolution, or worship and prayer. It doesn't seem like many people are cut out for that or want to do that. So then, what do you make of my opening 10-minute spiel here? Thanks for doing this.
I think you're basically correct. I think ultimately, if you take the criticism of consumerism, and we'll get to that in a second, to its conclusion, what you really need to do is you're basically making an argument against industrial society, ultimately, because otherwise, what are you? Who are you going to sell your products to? And if it is the case that you've got the guy who's really rich who pays to get his house remodeled, whatever, is a consumer, it's like, well, if you're specialized as a guy who's remodeling, and then the only sort of situation probably in which you could still be gainfully employed as that, but that kind of job at carpentry type thing is probably some sort of pre-industrial one where there's much less demand, the population is lower, so that you can sort of spend your time making things which help you achieve the lower levels on sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so physiological needs and security needs in particular. And it seems that if you have a situation where most people are spending their time doing something that isn't just achieving those bottom two, then somehow it's decadent or unvirtuous. And in a way, it's basically Ted Kay's critique. Ted Kay just wants everyone to be focused around physiological and security needs, or well, probably social needs as well. But beyond that, like, that's bad. Unless, as you point out, you can be an intellectual and therefore it's okay. So you need to be able, so if you do have your material baseline sort of sorted, the question is, what do you do with your time? And I think your point on hobbies is actually, I agree, I think is essentially the correct answer. I gave a thought experiment to some of the people I taught a number of years ago. And I was saying, like, okay, imagine that you were a multi-billionaire. What would you do with your time? And to be honest, I don't remember their answers. But their answers weren't just sitting around watching stuff and whatever. They would actually do something. It seems to me that what you would want to do in your free time is to do something that is, in the most broad sense, creative, a way in which you're able to provide value in what you do, either maybe even, as it were, only to yourself or to a small group of people or to others. So, I mean, I could imagine myself, for instance, if I had loads of time, I could play more computer games. But the thing is, would I just do that? That might just be boring, but I could imagine a situation in which I might make myself a YouTube channel in which I reviewed them. And then that would seem to have more sort of purposeful action associated with it than merely just playing it. And I think the critiques of people who are just watching stuff or playing games all the time, as it were, I think those are, reasonable insofar as they are sort of passive. And I suppose in a way, this was the critique. I do get annoyed with the people who laud books over any other art form. Oh, novels much better than films and TV, because they claim that sort of TV and film are passive. But it's like, well, you can read some pretty like lowbrow novels, which are sort of the equivalent of like lowbrow TV, like basic plot, straightforward, right? Really obvious cardboard characters, etc. So I think what you want to do with your time is to use it in a way that what you do, you're using your abilities to do something that otherwise wouldn't exist, in a way. Now, that's a very broad sense, and how to exactly delineate it is difficult. So with you sort of cycling, whatever, as a supporting, that's, you know, you're using your skills to achieve particular goals. You know, it takes effort and discipline, etc., to be able to do it. And yeah, it's absolutely fine. When it comes to so doing things like that, or if you like doing sports in general, fine. You know, again, when it comes to, so put it this way, you know, if you are somebody who watched like lots of TV, for instance, I mean, you could turn that more into a productive hobby by which, you know, you try to either review them, or you try to figure out, you know, how you could make them better, you could improve them. One thing my brother does, he plays a number of board games, is he ends up designing his own, or, well, it starts out of fixes the things he doesn't think work with the existing games, and then tries to improve them, which then ultimately ends up involving an entire redesign and almost an entire new game. Those things I think are valuable, and I think your kind of self-reported happiness of these sorts of people is likely to be higher, because they are, as I say, they're actually doing something. And I think as well, actually, with hobbies and doing things, is that people who have a better sense of their own agency tend to be on average happier than people who aren't, at least on self-reported studies, because they believe that they can have some sort of impact on the external world. Whereas if you're somebody who is, you know, you get ordered around at work and then just hook up to Netflix when you get home, well, then you're living like a very at a very low agentic level, as it were. So yeah, I mean, you have to have these hobbies, because if you're going to have a situation where you have free time, well, I think that to make that feel valuable, you need to have it as productive and to do something. And for a lot of people, that can't simply be writing another book or going to a debate on a particular topic. That's just unrealistic. And for people who think to take themselves seriously as cultural critics who can sort of imagine a better future for society as a whole, that's a bit stupid.
The point about the intellectual obsession with books and other and related novels, as opposed to TV and film, is something which I think is underrated. First of all, one of the patron saints of, so to speak, I know some leftists don't like this word, but Western civilization, aka ancient Greece, Socrates, was very much opposed to written communication anyway, using written communication as a kind of debasement. I think the reemergence of like long form conversations and podcasts is like a dream of Socrates in a sense. So it's like, it could be, and I oftentimes have the same issue when I have an idea in mind. I'd rather talk about it than write about it, just because I don't. Partly it's grammar issues, but it's also partly because it's sometimes you need 5 connected sentences to explain an idea rather than one clear sentence. Now, maybe AI can clean up the writing, so to speak, and get it clearer. However, that's hard to do. And then the question of agency and ownership starts coming back in. So like a topic like this, for example, I've been thinking about this. I think about this a lot anytime I'm not working, for example, or a decent amount. You know, what would a good life with or without working or away from work actually consist of? Because Marx has the dream of, you know, you fish in the morning, you hunt in the afternoon, and you debate philosophy at night. Unlike some rightists, I'm not actually opposed to any of that. You know, it's like I don't actually, the idea, the utopia itself, I don't oppose. I don't oppose the communist utopia, or at least aspects of it, as described. And actually many libertarian or religious, like New Zion or Amish colony or something like that, they start ending up mirroring them anyway. So utopias tend to often look similar. Now, whether utopias would just consist of nonstop prayer or nonstop intellectual debates all the time, that to me is the modern equivalent of debating how many angels are on a pinhead to some extent. I would say that in a truly perfect society, what would there be to debate? We just know things. You wouldn't need to argue. Or in a truly good world, like, why would you even need to work? Things could just be made by some sort of AI robot system. And again, this takes us into the deeper end of the pool. But I think thinking about this is useful because we can reflect back at what our current existence in society is, what we do. When it comes to hobbies, I can't help but sense a derision by the intellectual class, both on the far left and the far right. And again, I'm only using these terms technically, on what most quote-unquote common or ordinary people, as well as not so ordinary people, do with their time. There's a big hoopla about video games, and oddly enough, today it's not just like religious conservatives making that. It's people, mainstream, like center-left people, are saying everyone's getting radicalized by video games. And again, I will show you the receipts of articles of this manner. This is not like some fringe website I'm referring to. And sports, another thing. This is another hobby that gets critiqued. And again, it's not just the right that's doing this. As I mentioned earlier, as other intellectuals as well. So, and as well as music, they'll complain that music has been, co-opted by the machine. And we've done an episode on Roger Scruton on the tyranny of popular music. But if you ask people what music they listen to, they tend not to listen to Bach. They tend to listen to Taylor Swift. Now, again, you can get into the organized from above type mentality. Why does Taylor Swift exist? We can talk about IP and so forth and so forth and so on. But, as the society exists, this is what people do. We can put utopia on one side and just look at the current existing world. That's what people do. And I'm curious whether you think the average American or average British or average Westerner, and I would also throw, from my experience of Chinese people, they, contrary to what some tankies and some outsiders think, and this is probably also true of people living in Iran, people living in Turkey, and so forth, they live pretty quote-unquote Western bourgeois lifestyles. The idea that there exists some culture that lives a pre-industrial lifestyle is largely dead. I mean, I've watched enough Russian YouTube, and I have no experience of actual Russia. But like internally, Russia just looks like some of the, some places more affluent parts of the United States, but much of the world has been flattened. We've sort of discussed this with our episode on Nick Land. People everywhere that have access to high-speed internet start seeming to live very similar lives, for better or worse. So my question for you is Nick Gillespie the quote-unquote modern globalized establishment at its best? Again, let's get away from the fake wars and the fake pandemics and fake BS like that. Would you say what Nick Gillespie and Reason Magazine defends, as they do, is like the establishment as best? What would you make that point? And what would you make my other points about the good life and the fetishism of books? Swithin?
I think, if you're sort of like a quote-unquote socially liberal capitalist, then yeah, clearly Reason are you guys. And if you did want to make what I would claim would be the best case for sort of the current economic paradigm, it would be socially liberal capital, like quote unquote capitalism, because you don't have all the war stuff and surveillance and whatever. And so yeah, I mean that's kind of what that's the way you would defend it. The book things are annoying. It is interesting you mentioned Plato, because Plato was very much he preferred speech rather than writing things down, because people get lazy and not remember things because they could read them instead. With your point about saying things, one thing I've done in the past is if I'm not sure, I want to sort of think about an idea. What I'll do is I'll use text to speech or just record myself, because the fact of recording it helps me to clarify what I'm thinking, and then I can read over it again and go, oh, well, actually, one of the problems is when I do that, it's a bit random with lots of ums and repetitions. But actually, I've realized what I could do now is I could whack it into AI and say, clean this up grammatically. And then I could see what my argument is and then modify it. So just talking is quite useful. When I have an idea, it's really helpful to talk to people. So I think you're right with that. And having long form podcasts and stuff, it would be interesting to see what Plato would think of Joe Rogan or someone like that with his extremely long podcasts, which would be interesting. But then going on to the fetishization of books is really quite annoying. I think it's almost like a way of creating a hierarchy. It's like, oh no, we're not lowbrow, we are highbrow, so therefore we have books, and it's a way of sort of differentiating themselves from others. The books. Oh, you said something else. I can't remember what it was. On you said something. You asked me about related to books.
Is there more to life than just making the revolution?
Oh yes. Well, yes, of course, because the problem was what happened after the revolution, which is interesting. That was one of Todd Lewis's criticisms of the left. And also why I argued why the Star Wars films didn't work, because, well, the sequels is because, well, they realized they didn't know what they wanted to make, as in what would the Republic look like after the Empire. So they basically just had to reboot it and do the same trilogy again, but new and slightly different and browner, because oh well, we don't really have any ideas of what it looks like. We're just permanent revolutionaries. We're always against things. I'm never for anything. So,
do you think intellectuals are engaged in a form of consumerism? Because if they produce books, now you can put debates on IP aside, whether or not you think it's true. I mean, you still think they'll come up with other revenue streams to pay for their authorship, or maybe they won't. But do you think intellectuals, by producing books and papers, as well as teaching classes, are also engaged in a form of consumerism, even if they don't recognize it?
Yeah. Well, I think if you're someone who just reads and sort of doesn't do anything with it, I mean, if it's someone you read and then you, as I say, do something like this, or you try to, or you're somebody who, makes a lot of notes in the margins and, you maybe write a little bit yourself or whatever, then, maybe not. But otherwise, if we're going to say that consumerism is just sort of, to a large extent, passive consumption, then even when you're reading, there are ways in which you can be more or less passive. And on that basis, then, yeah, you could. Now, I now remember what I was going to say. You asked about, what do people do with their time in music and stuff, and they listen to Taylor Swift, and rather than listen to Bach. I think to be fair, this is where Roger Scruton is quite good. Roger Scruton, towards the end of his life, was actually reasonably well disposed towards Metallica, interestingly. I don't think he was a huge fan of Metallica, but he thought the music had value. These very angry young men, and he thought it was, I think we discussed this before, in a relevant sense, authentic, and had it had some meaningful content lyrically and musically. So I think the cultural critics at the best have an idea of what makes sort of quote unquote good folk music. And by folk, I don't mean sort of folk as in Paul Simon folk. I mean folk as in non-classical. If you were to essentially split it between a complex and simple continuum, that there is sort of good, relatively simple music. And that's going to be generally more popular amongst people with lower IQs. But then there can be good, more complex music, which you could broadly say is what it means to be classical. Although some of the classical stuff is sort of relatively straightforward. So it doesn't exactly work. But, if someone was to defend Bach against Taylor Swift, one thing they'd go, is sort of like the complexity and sophistication of it. But I think if you are able to see, are there good versions of like relatively simple stuff? I mean, same with food. I mean, not all food has to be 3 Michelin star level food. You can just cook good, simple food that's tasty, and it's still good food. I think these sort of critics need a similar idea with all sort of other art forms, and then this would make utopia more realistic and actually something that's populated with people other than themselves. I think that's where the culture critics really need to go with that kind of thing.
To go back to Nick Gillespie and Reason Magazine, why do you think intellectuals are so critical of, and this includes both like the big brain right-wing ones as well as the left-wing ones, the Deleuze-Guattari? Because I think one of the things that people mistake on the right is that the left is all pro-pop culture. When that's true of the center. I think that's true of the normie center. The Paul Krugmans and those types. That's true of them. But if you go far enough left, you end up being quite critical of, and actually in some ways their criticisms of pop culture are actually more piercing than just saying this is degenerate Satanism. Like Deleuze and Guattari on pop culture, like it's you're never quite clear if they actually like it. If anything, they'll probably dislike it possibly even more than someone like a Roger Scruton would. Maybe not Metallica, and they might find value in Metallica, but someone like Sabrina Carpenter, for example, I don't or something like that, like the worst of pop music to some extent. But like, why are intellectuals so critical of? Is it because it's lowbrow? Is it because it's poorly made? I think the poorly made critique could apply to some of the stuff, but not all the stuff. And sports, men and increasingly women, thanks to feminism, spend a huge time either doing or watching sports. I mean, that's a huge component of people time, and most thick religious people are at best neutral, at worst outright critical. I'm talking about like religious scholars. It's not. Although David Bentley Hart likes to watch the Baltimore Orioles, that's something that surprises me, and he actually legitimately does, because Tyler Cowen caught him following the game while he was interviewing him. Supposedly, this is a report I heard that I always thought was funny. But like, if you ask someone like Chris Hedges, I found out that Chris Hedges likes chess, but like Chris Hedges liking football, or someone like that liking football, just strikes me as surprising. And I think it would be surprising because not many intellectuals like sports, or not many intellectuals like doing sports, let alone watching them. But these are what things, quote unquote, common people since industrial evolution have done in their quote unquote free time. Why do you think there's such the derision, Swithin?
I think it's lowbrow. I just think they think, no, I don't like this. This is all beneath simple, mindless stuff. Also, as well, with things like sports, they'll go, oh no, this is all bread and circuses. It's part of the way to dull the mind so that you don't focus on the revolution, that kind of stuff. But I think it's mostly just because it's lowbrow. I think I don't like this term, but you could argue it's basically classism. I think. Now that said, there are people who would say it's badly made. I mean, related to Taylor Swift, for instance, I remember listening to Jimmy Dore, and Jimmy Dore was like, "This is just music. Taylor Swift's just musically bereft." You'd have sort of like an idea for a song, and what they would do is, instead of making one song with all these few interesting elements in, what they will do is they'll just break it up into like 3 separate songs, which is even more simplified and just done to make more money. Also, as well, I think the criticism say of Taylor Swift is it's so well attuned to what the audience wants to hear that it's well, I think this is one criticism as well when it comes to art, is that popular stuff that's popular stuff, which is popular, obviously, is sort of crafted in a way that mattresses to just suit the audience. And there's an idea that that art should be challenging in relevant sense by the more intellectual class, and therefore, for that reason, it kind of loses value. So you get sort of very simple music songs, which are, so let's take Taylor Swift, that are just sort of tailored almost directly to single women who have relationship issues, and that's basically it. There's nothing. I'm no Taylor Swift expert. My understanding is Taylor Swift was actually relatively interesting before she became mainstream, but we'll leave that aside. But this is the kind of critique, is that somehow art should be meaningful and challenging, and that these sort of artists simply don't have that there. Now, I think Scruton to some extent, though, I think slightly defends the Beatles as well, of being sort of musically interesting. They took risks, innovated, and they had something of value to say. So I do, as I say, Scruton is quite an interesting and fair critic. But the criticism that people make on sports and TV and stuff, I think they have a lot of truth to the criticisms, but they are insufficiently nuanced, and they don't take it as part of an overall diet of what people are actually doing. And also, I would say as well, I mean, if you are working as much as you are, I mean, there isn't as much time for sort of productive hobbies as you otherwise would have. So the fact that you engage in sort of like quote unquote merely consumptive activity, I mean, seems to me to be entirely reasonable if you literally have only a couple of hours and you've worked, because trying to engage in productive hobbies, as it were, is time consuming and takes mental effort in most cases, which is, you don't really have much to expend at that point. A genuine utopia would be more diverse in properly understood than many intellectuals would claim, unless, of course, they just want to clone themselves, in which case it might look like the way they want to, but otherwise it probably wouldn't. And with that, I'd now like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrime liberty show@gmail.com. That's mindcrime liberty show@gmail.com.